Hi, I'm Phil with Team Learn to Win at Stanford, and we are excited to share the solution that we've built through the Hacking for Defense class this quarter. Our team consists of 4 students who are collectively attending the Stanford Graduate School of Business, Graduate School of Education, Stanford Law School, and Stanford Engineering School. We have 2 military affiliated personnel on the team who have a combined total of 13 years experience. And also 2 of our team members have conducted work to build a startup company, which was, and their experience was pretty instrumental in getting us to our final solution for this class. We're excited to talk to you more about that. So the bottom line up front, we are using the mobile app from that startup company to provide some critical training to Air Force pilots. We've tested it at 2 facilities. We've applied for funds through SBIR and STTR. And we learned this week that there are procurement talks occurring at the 4-star level and that our chances look really good. So what do pilots have to say about our solution? They say things like, the money we spend on our current materials is a waste, like we should be using this instead. This is an area of great need. I would have paid my own money for this as an F-22 pilot. So a lot of enthusiasm there. Same goes for instructors. They say things like, we don't just want to use this to train pilots. We want to use this for the guys in the tower and the maintainers. We see a lot of versatility and flexibility in this idea. And then most importantly, we have statements like this, where this 05 commander of the training squadron at Beale Air Force Base says, we'd like to buy this. What are the next steps in moving forward? And then his headquarters office back in Virginia sends this back saying, this won't just apply to the U-2s. I want to find applications for this in all Combat Air Force formal training units. In other words, this won't just be for your unit. I see force-wide utility coming out of this solution. As a more recent example, this week, we had a senior executive service deputy to the 2-star at Air Combat Command. You can see the 2-star is CC'd in this email. Essentially saying, hey, we want to send this up to the 4-star ACC commander because we think there's great gains that can be made from implementing the team's approach. And I think he's going to give them the resources to move out and implement this. So we want to tell you why these people are so excited. And to do that, we'll start with a little bit of background. So there are 3 main phases to pilot training. Undergraduate pilot training, training at the formal training units, also known as IQT, and operational squadrons where the training happens as continuation training or CT. So in undergraduate pilot training, trainees train on the T6. That is their first introduction to flying. And there is some innovation happening there. This is what it looks like. Pilot Training Next is the name of the entity that's conducting this innovation. And what their thesis is, what they're really doing is they're moving from simulators to VR headsets. Because of the fact that they can buy 1,000 VR headsets for the cost of every simulator. And having all those headsets gives them the capability to give it to a pilot and say, hey, use this whenever is best for you. Keep this in your room. If you want to get reps at night, go ahead and get reps. Fly is essentially breaking down that access barrier of I have to schedule time in a simulator and we only have one of them on the base and there's a 24-hour schedule. Giving the pilots the tools to do this training whenever is convenient for them in the hope that they use it more. And that's a powerful idea, which really informed our solution, which we'll talk about in a little bit. The second stage of training is at the formal training unit. This is called IQT, or Initial Qualification Training. And this is where pilots learn to fly their aircraft they're assigned for the first time. We identified that there's a problem in IQT. There's some knowledge gaps from that training process, which we'll talk more about in a moment. But that was one of the problems that we identified through this class. And then lastly, at the operational squadrons, trainees can continue to conduct training. It's referenced as continuation training, with the idea being that we want to, number 1, close the gaps of the things we didn't learn in IQT, and number 2, prevent information atrophy over the course of a pilot's career, to keep that information sharp and ready to go. So what's the problem? So we'll start with this observation. The best air crews are the ones that are the most book smart. We saw this in action during our trip to Tinker Air Force Base when we went in the simulator and the instructors leading the simulator gave us a checklist. We had an in-flight emergency. We started doing the checklist and figured out pretty quick that the checklist can only take you so far. Life is too complex to be boiled down to rote checklists. And in those situations, your knowledge of the engineering systems of the aircraft is your first and last line of defense. So that is why that engineering, that emergency procedure knowledge is so important, and that's why this experienced pilot from the headquarters back east told us that, in his view, the best air crews are the most book smart. So that's true, but it's also true that learning during IQT is not effective. We heard people call it drinking from a fire hose, and the big problem here is that people are focused on flights to the exclusion of academics. As you can see in the pictures on the right-hand side, one of these activities is a little bit more fundamentally exciting than the other. And there's also the very calculated thought that a bad flight is going to fail somebody out of the program, whereas bad academics are something that can be made up. So pilots, rightfully so, are focusing on the flights during the IQT. And so the target of what the Air Force is hoping for out of IQT is 70% retention of material. So continuation training, that third phase of pilot training, is where we would expect those information gaps to be closed, to go from 70% to as close to 100% as we can. But current CT practices are missing the mark. And we discovered this during week 6 when we were conducting an interview. And we'd been hearing a lot of signal in the noise up to that point, but this really brought it into focus. We were conducting an interview, and one of the senior officers we were interviewing said, there is no continuation training. CT isn't getting done. We had a captain tell us that people have access to these tools, but nobody's using them. And another pilot tell us, if you could find us a way to sustainably and effectively conduct continuation training, you're going to make eyes moist with tears of joy. So people knew that this wasn't getting done, and our job was to figure out, why is it not getting done? So to do that, we looked at the two sets of tools that are out there to conduct continuation training. There's manual review of PowerPoints and PDFs and computer-based trainings. Each of those tools has its problems. For manual review of PowerPoints and PDFs, the first barrier to learning is functionality. PowerPoints obviously and PDFs obviously not interactive. They can't ask me questions. Their utility is somewhat limited in that way, and that's a small barrier. But the big one is this: accessibility. And the thought is that combing through 1,000 documents that average out at 1,000 pages, and you've got a whole stack of these things, is a fundamentally time-consuming and inefficient activity. And the time competition from these pilots, leadership jobs, flight schedules, administrative jobs, really crowds out the amount of time that's available to do this kind of studying. And so it isn't getting done in a meaningful way. So right now the approach is, here's material, stay on top of it. And that just doesn't work because people don't have the time resources to do this. And then for computer-based trainings, we saw that there's the same two barriers. There's a functionality barrier to learning and an accessibility barrier to learning. We learned more about that during the following weeks of the course, but our fundamental observation was that these high-budget items are just fundamentally not getting used. And here's a visual illustration of that. This is the CBT room at Tinker Air Force Base. This is the one room where people can conduct computer-based training at Tinker Air Force Base, because the CBTs aren't available. They're not available on Windows or iOS. So this is the one place you can do it. And as you can see, nobody's there. We had people tell us 3 times during our visit that nobody is using these things. And that just kind of struck a chord of dissonance with us a little bit. Because on one hand, we had these instructors at the facility telling us, hey, these computer-based trainings are great. When I do them, I can see how much I've forgotten since the last time I did them. And when students do it before class, we know who did and who didn't. And so those great things they had to say just didn't square up with this empty room that we found. And so we had to figure out, why is this room empty? And the reason is because it's off base. So if somebody wants to do a computer-based training, they have to hop in their car and drive 13 minutes to this off-base facility, where these computer-based trainings are, and nobody has the time to do that. The return on investment for the amount of transit time you expend just skews the equation, and so that's why these aren't getting used. So in summary, these are the current tools that are available for continuation training. So you can see on the low end of functionality, we have paper manuals, PowerPoint slides, PDFs. Some of the PDFs are on the electronic flight bag, which is the iPad that pilots can take around with them. So they are a little bit more accessible in terms of having it with you, but not accessible, because of the fact that if I have to hunt through 1,000 plus page document to find useful bits of information, that information that I care about isn't accessible. It's not brought to me. And then on the higher up on the functionality side, we have these computer-based trainings, which are probably designed to provide more functionality, but those aren't accessible. So at the extreme end of inaccessibility, you have things like Tinker Air Force Base, where you have to physically go off base. But even for other computer-based trainings, you have to be on a desktop machine at work with your CAP card plugged in. And that acts as a barrier to learning that still deters people from doing this. And it wasn't just at Tinker Air Force Base that people told us these aren't being used. It was everywhere. So why does this problem exist? Well, it's because pilot training hasn't changed in 40 years. And that was what our sponsor originally called us to do. And as evidence of that, we discovered another problem while we were at Tinker. The computer-based trainings that are done are graded by hand on paper sheets in a 3-ring binder. So that totally robs people of any analytical capability that would ordinarily be used and needed to evaluate the effectiveness of the training that's being conducted. So if we have people consistently missing questions on a quiz, we can't track those knowledge gaps before they result in a mishap. Wing commanders can't tell which units have subpar training in a way that would allow them to intervene before a situation occurs on their watch. Also, there's no way to tell which subjects are being neglected. So hydraulic systems are very popular on the E3. They show up in 90% of check rides, so people train to that. But if they train exclusively to that, they're missing functionality on other systems. And if an electrical emergency pops up during flight, they need to be prepared to deal with that. And then lastly, there's no way to structure information revisit rates without data. So if it's been 3 years since I've last learned about an electrical system, it's probably time for me to see something about an electrical system. Right now, under the current system, nothing like this exists. So what's the solution? Learn to win. It's great. It's sexy. It's got all this fun, fancy stuff. And Phil's late for his meeting at the law firm, so I got to run here. But this is some of the stuff we can talk about. And then at the end, we can jump to this, the side by side. What gives you better analysis? Learn to win or a paper grade book? What gives you better functionality? These non-interactive trainings or lesson to learn, quiz to confirm? And which is going to get used more? Something I have to drive off base to do or something I can pull out of my pocket? The thesis of PT and applied academics, great tagline, we'll use it. Good stuff, guys.